Have such fabulous speakers to help us understand this crazy, crazy election season better. And we have three wonderful students who are going to introduce the speakers. After they introduce the speakers, we're going to give them time to talk and say a few words. And then we have two microphones set up right in the front here. And we're hoping a lot of you will come down and ask the speakers questions. When you ask the question, say your name, what grade you're in, and ask them anything you'd like about the elections. Okay, girls, you want to come up and introduce the speakers?
Hi, I have the pleasure of introducing Ms. Joy-Ann Reid today. Joy-Ann Reid is a political analyst for MSNBC and host of AM Joy. She's also the author of the book Fracture, Barack Obama, the Clintons, and the Racial Divide. Mr. Starr highly recommends this book, and she is a columnist at the Daily Beast. Previously, Ms. Reid was the host of The Reid Report on MSNBC, and before that, she was the managing editor of thegrio.com, a daily online news and opinion platform devoted to delivering stories that reflect the African American experience. Ms. Reid is a former talk radio producer and host for Radio 1. During the 2004 presidential campaign, Reid served as the Florida Deputy Communications Director for the 527 America Coming Together initiative, and she was a press aide in the final stretch of President Barack Obama's Florida campaign in 2008. Ms. Reid's columns and articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Miami Herald, and Salon.com. Reid graduated from Harvard University in 1991 with a concentration in film and is a 2003 Knight Center for Specialized Journalism Fellow. She currently resides in Brooklyn with her husband and family. Follow her on Twitter at Joy-Ann Reid.
Hi guys, can you guys see me? Okay. I have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Ray Suarez. Veteran journalist Ray Suarez was most recently the host of Al Jazeera America's daily news program, Inside Story. Before that, Mr. Suarez spent 14 years as a correspondent and anchor at the PBS NewsHour. During his years at PBS, Suarez covered many stories, and he moderated two presidential primary candidates' debates in 2004 and 2008. Before arriving at the NewsHour, Mr. Suarez was the Washington-based host of NPR's Talk of the Nation. The New York Times called Suarez the thinking man's talk show host and a national resource. During his decades as a broadcaster, Mr. Suarez also did extensive work as a writer. He wrote the 2013 companion volume to the PBS documentary series, Latino Americans. He also published an examination of the tightening relationship between religion and electoral politics entitled The Holy Vote, The Politics of Faith in America. Mr. Suarez has received many acknowledgments. For instance, UCLA's School of Public Policy awarded Mr. Suarez its Public Policy Leadership Prize for his coverage of urban America. The National Council of La Raza gave Suarez its Ruben Salazar Award, and the National Association of Hispanic Journalists inducted him into the organization's Hall of Fame in 2010. Mr. Suarez holds a BA in African History from New York University and an MA from the University of Chicago. He also holds 14 honorary doctorates from universities across America. An active layman in the Episcopal Church, Mr. Suarez currently serves as a member of the chapter, the Board of Trustees of Washington National Cathedral. A native of Brooklyn, New York, Mr. Suarez and his wife currently live here in Washington, D.C.
I have the pleasure of introducing Ms. Judy Woodruff. Broadcast journalist Judy Woodruff is the co-anchor and managing editor of the PBS NewsHour. She has covered political events and other news for more than 3 decades at CNN, NBC, and PBS. For 12 years, Ms. Woodruff served as anchor and senior correspondent for CNN, where her duties included anchoring the weekday program Inside Politics. At PBS, she was the chief Washington correspondent for the McNeil Labor NewsHour, and she also anchored PBS's award-winning weekly documentary series, Frontline with Judy Woodruff. In 2011, Woodruff was the principal reporter for the PBS documentary, Nancy Reagan, The Role of a Lifetime. And in 2007, she completed an extensive project on the views of young Americans called Generation Next, Speak Up, Be Heard. Ms. Woodruff has been a visiting professor at Duke University as well as at Harvard University. Ms. Woodruff is a founding co-chair of the International Women's Media Foundation, an organization dedicated to promoting and and encouraging women in communication industries. She serves on the boards of trustees of many organizations, including the Freedom Forum and the Museum. Ms. Woodruff is the recipient of the Sign Lifetime Achievement Award, a Duke Distinguished Alumni Award, the Edward R. Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Broadcast Journalism, University of Southern California Walter Cronkite Award for Excellence in Journalism, and the Gaylord Prize for Excellence in Journalism and Mass Communications from the University of Oklahoma. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband. Please join me in welcoming all of our distinguished guests this evening.
Start. I'll claim seniority since I've been a journalist probably as long as Ray and Joy have been together. I just want to say how happy I am to be back at NCS. I've had the honor of coming to speak to students here a couple of times in the past in election years, and it's been a treat every time. The next thing I want to say is how fortunate you all are to be listening to Ray Suarez and Joy Ann Reid this morning. I am huge fans of both of them. Ray, I know, is someone I've known for a long time as a former colleague at the NewsHour, just someone who's had an amazing and distinguished career. He's a great human being, a great dad, and you can hear him talk a lot about American politics in a minute. Joy and I just met this morning, but I am a huge fan of her work. I listen to her whenever I get a chance, and I learn something every time she speaks. So you are in for a treat this morning. I'm going to keep my remarks very brief, just to tell all of you that I've been covering politics actually longer than 3 decades. It's more like 4. My first presidential election was 1976, and I've covered every one since then. I've never seen an election like this one. In the first instance, historical to have a woman running for president, to have a serious chance as the nominee of a major political party. We know women have run for president before, but they've never gotten as close as we see in 2016. And of course, also to have someone running who comes from outside of politics, who's had a business career, someone who's coming at the American political scene from a completely different background and a different personal history. And that's made, it's part of what's made this election as unexpected and so full of the twists and turns that we've seen. I just want to say to all of you that I hope you're paying close attention to this election, because it really does matter. I know you have conversations about it at home with your parents and your siblings and with your friends, but it really, really does matter. There are a lot of headlines and a lot of whispering about who said what and who didn't say something and who's telling the truth and who isn't. But what matters is that you ask these questions and you try to get answers. And I know all of you are getting a great education here at NCS, so you know what really counts is that whatever you hear from out on the campaign trail or whatever you hear somebody say about this election, you want to check it out. You want to go back and talk to your classmates, talk to your teachers. Yes, it's good to go online, but that may not be enough. You need to look to other sources and make sure you've got the right information. I think, to me, that's one of the great lessons of this election. There's so much flying around out there that is not substantiated, that has not been proven. And for people to make the right decision, they have to base it on something that's close to what's the truth, to the facts. So I know all of you are doing that, and I hope you'll do it even more between now and Election Day. I look forward to taking your questions. I'm excited to be here, and I'm glad to turn it over to Ray and then Joy.
It must be very frustrating to just miss voting in this election, which I assume many of you are going to just miss. A lot of the most interesting stories about this election and what it means will really be on a clock that starts running the morning of November 9th. Whether political parties take the lessons of this election and apply them in future elections, or see it as a peculiar, once-in-a-lifetime black swan event, really will define whether this is a one-off that we'll never see anything like it again, or whether it's something that changes the politics of the country. At every single juncture, people who are smart and whose opinions I respect, who are in the game, told me that it was impossible for Donald Trump to become the Republican nominee for president. Last year, people told me he wouldn't even make it to Iowa. After Iowa, people told me he wouldn't rise out of the pack. After he rose out of the pack, people said he wouldn't actually get the nomination in Cleveland. People who run campaigns, who raise money, who have been part of the Republican Party for a long time. So in the space of 18 short months, he's rewritten the book on how you run for president. And whether it works or not, we'll have a lot to say in the coming years about what the party does and what it doesn't do about its presidential candidates and campaigns. And we can talk more about Hillary Clinton. Of course, as Judy mentioned, it's a historic election in many, many ways, but it would be an entirely different election if the Republicans had nominated a more conventional candidate. And here's Joy.
So it's really an honor to be here. I want to thank Mr. Sarr for inviting me and the young ladies who introduced us. Thank you all. Is my mic off? Oh, here we go. Oh, that's why the good morning was quiet, because I'm quiet. Oh, there we go. Good morning. So it's really wonderful to be here. Thank you to Mr. Sarr. Thank you to the young ladies who introduced us and did such a great job. It's really a terrific honor to be here with Judy and Ray. Judy and I took a selfie earlier because I was just being a complete fangirl. She's one of, I mean, this is an incredible panel. I feel incredibly inadequate sitting next to them, but these are legends in the journalism business, so take advantage of their presence here and ask them questions. My end of this sort of spectrum is a little bit different because I work in cable news, which a lot of people blame for the situation that we're in now. But it is an incredibly historic election, as my colleagues here have said. There are only a handful of countries in the world that have ever elected a member of a racial or ethnic minority to be their head of state. The United States did that in 2008. And it was an incredibly convulsive thing to have Barack Obama become the president. It seems sort of mundane and ordinary to you guys because your generation was just raised in a different ethnic context about what race means, but it was really revolutionary for that to happen. And now the United States is poised to become one of a little over a dozen countries that have managed to elect a woman. But the United States is behind in that regard. If Hillary Clinton were to become president, then the US would join countries like Liberia, Israel, Germany, Great Britain, even Pakistan that have gotten there before we did in terms of electing a woman to be the head of state. And it's actually also a very revolutionary thing. And the book that I wrote, Fracture, is about the kind of racial revolution that created the opportunity for Barack Obama. But the period we're in right now is just as convulsive. We underestimate, I think, because girls are so powerful and awesome, and you guys kind of feel like you run the world, particularly at your age. But it's really actually difficult for a woman to rise to the point where she's even in position to be president of the United States. So if that happens, it's going to be a very, very big deal. So hopefully you guys are paying attention to the election, because you have not only that, but the first time you have somebody basically from my business, somebody from the media. Right? Somebody from the media also becoming a viable candidate for president. The last time something even close to that happened was Ronald Reagan, who was an actor, but who had, after that, become a governor, so that he had some governing experience. So we do have an election unlike anything that we've ever seen before. So with that, I will welcome your questions.
So, Olivia has agreed to ask the first question. If you'd like to ask a question, you can just come up to either mic, form a line, and ask to your heart's content.
Hi, thank you for coming and speaking to us today.
I'm wondering, how do you keep your personal opinions from interfering with your reporting and writing?
How do you keep them from, is that what you said?
Yes, like how do you keep your writing and reporting neutral when it needs to be?
Well, when I started out as a reporter, and it was over 40 years ago, I was taught, I didn't go to journalism school, by the way. I studied political science, a little bit of history in college. Didn't really think about journalism until I was just about to finish college and was looking for a job. But the first thing I was told was people don't really care what you think. They want you to go out, and what we want you to do and what the public wants you to do is go out, gather information, gather facts, come back, turn it into a story, and that's what we want to know. We're not interested in your views. And so from the very beginning, it was drummed into me that that was my job as a news reporter. And that stayed with me ever since all those many years ago. And to this day, when what you all see, when you look at much of the news media, is journalists who are comfortable expressing their opinion, depending on what their role is. If they're an editorial writer or an analyst, they're free to give their opinion. But if they're calling themselves a reporter and their job is to gather facts, they really shouldn't be doing that. And so I still don't do that. It's not what I do. I'm the reporter and anchor, and as we said, managing editor at the NewsHour. And I still don't think people really want to know what in fact, they absolutely don't want to know what I think. And if they think I'm somehow raising an eyebrow or leaning to one side when I do an interview, they may interpret it one way or another, because they're now so accustomed to people in the media expressing an opinion. But for me, it's honestly not hard. Obviously, I have opinions, I'm human, and I don't believe there's any such thing as pure objectivity. We all have opinions, but I absolutely do the best I can to try to keep them out of my reporting.
We have had the fortune or misfortune, depending on your point of view, to live through and work through an era where that assumption of objectivity was changing. There's just a lot more opinion journalism out there, day in and day out. And what that's done is it's made it even difficult for those who are writing from the old-fashioned posture of disinterestedness, which is even-handedness, the idea that you tell all sides of the story and leave it up to the reader, listener, viewer to make up their mind. So that even if you are doing that, it's assumed that you are putting your thumb on the scale anyway, which has made it difficult. Every time in the last 20 years that I've covered immigration, for example, for a national outlet, there have been letters to my news organization, the various places that I've worked, saying, how can you possibly let Ray Suarez cover immigration? And it makes me crazy, but I assure you that I didn't have my thumb on the scale, but it didn't matter, because you become like a flag or a brand or a logo or an emblem, and they just assume that when they see you and hear your name, that you are not being balanced and even-handed, which makes it difficult, I'm sure, for women on the Clinton plane. I'm sure it makes it difficult in all kinds of venues for journalists to do it the old-fashioned way. And quite often, a lot of places have just said, well, we're just not going to do it that way anymore, and people will get used to that, and they have. So it's a really mixed up kind of time to be doing the old-fashioned just the facts ma'am journalism when everyone has become quite accustomed and even wants you to give your opinions. When I've been invited to speak on various programs, they say, well, we actually want more of you. And I say, yeah, but I can't give you more of me, because if I do that, then I can't go on the next day and say I'm doing it, you know, balanced and without putting my thumb on the scale. So it's an interesting and bizarre time to be in the news business for a lot of reasons.
So, hi, I'm Joy from Cable News. we're on a completely different, we're under a completely different mandate. And I actually come from opinion journalism. I'm a little bit different in that I used to work in local news for a while, which was more straight ahead journalism, but then I left news in 2003, and I actually worked in campaign world. I actually worked in politics, in Democratic politics, and then when I came out of that, I became an opinion journalist. I wrote columns. So I'm in a little bit of a different position. It's my job to give my opinion, and so it's a little different. And I think cable news, the sort of invention of it came about in part because there was this market for opinion-based journalism, particularly from the right. Fox News, which was the original, well, CNN was the original cable news network. That's what CNN actually stands for. So it was the original, and it was really sort of straight ahead news and journalism 24 hours a day. But there's been this market for particularly conservative opinion that has existed for a really long time. And not to go into it at length, but it traces back really to the coverage of the civil rights movement and the perception that journalists from the New York Times, from the Chicago Tribune, from purportedly objective media outlets were going down to the South and covering the civil rights movement and not being balanced about it, essentially taking the side of the black civil rights marchers over the side of the segregationists. That perception of the media was exacerbated in the 1970s when busing started, when black students were being bused into white neighborhoods. Suddenly in the North, you had people saying, wait a minute, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune are not objective, but it's not about the South anymore. Now they're in the North and they're judging us because we don't want busing in our communities. And then if you add to that things like Roe versus Wade, which some of the older students here have learned about, meaning the legalization of abortion causes huge social upheaval. And there was this sense that those who had the value that that was wrong were not being represented in the news. So in cable, you have this market where you've got viewers who want to hear news from a conservative perspective going to Fox News, viewers who want to hear news from a more liberal perspective coming to MSNBC where I work, and then CNN falling somewhere in between, where a lot of what CNN is about now is the clash between the right and the left. And that's sort of the way that the entertainment value is produced at that network. So I think the world really has changed. It's become a lot more difficult for journalists who even are trying to be objective to be perceived that way, because no one believes that anyone is objective anymore. Most of the audience believes that if the news they're hearing is something that is unpleasant to them or which doesn't affirm their values, then the belief is, well, that outlet is not objective. There are a lot of Trump voters right now, quite frankly, who think New York Times is not objective because the stories that are coming out are harming their preferred candidate. A lot of Clinton supporters have long believed that the entire Washington press corps is unobjective because they think the stories that come out about her emails, etc., are harming her. So I think it's the most difficult question right now, I think, in news. I think we would all agree.
Hi. Hello. Okay. My name is Sky, and I'm a senior here. So my question continues on the topic of media and politics. So how do you think, what role do you think mainstream media played in creating the Donald? As in extensive coverage of his past interviews and spending so much time and energy on playing information about him, particularly in the beginning of the campaign cycle. What role do you think that played in the creation of the Donald?
I think that's a really, really interesting question, and we could spend a lot of time talking
Nobody would
about
get to
it.
ask another question.
Nobody would get to ask another question, as Ray said. I'll just say that I think the story is a complicated one, because in the beginning, I think many mainstream journalists didn't take Donald Trump seriously. They thought, here comes somebody from the world of reality TV and from having his name on buildings, and he couldn't possibly be someone who's going to go very far in the political world. And he's not somebody who's likely to go very far in the Republican primaries, where you had 14 or 15 or 16 other individuals running for the Republican nomination who were either senators or congressmen or former or governors or people with what we call political credentials attached to their name and their history and their identity. But lo and behold, Donald Trump went along and participated in some debates, many debates during the primary season, and showed that he could dominate the other candidates. and he was declared the winner, however that can be described, in enough debates that the media started taking him more and more seriously, giving him more and more airtime. I think cable and other television as well. All news organizations started paying more attention to him because he was this phenomenon. So yes, absolutely, he has gotten, I think, an enormous amount of airtime, newspaper space, media space, because of what he's accomplished. At the same time, many people have had this skepticism about him because he didn't have any political or government experience. So it's a mixed bag. As I said, we could talk about it a long time, but I think there are going to be many term papers and probably dissertations for people looking for their PhDs in the years to come, trying to figure out what role the media played in Donald Trump's success.
We, as practitioners, like new shiny objects. And a politician, or someone who's just become a politician, who's willing to say outrageous things and say them on our air, is a new shiny object. If you watched any of the primary season debates, you've probably, well, I'm going to assume that you've never seen a candidate do what he did during those debates, call his opponents names, not somewhere in the trail or a rally 1,000 miles away, but on the stage, standing with them. Lion Ted, and Little Marco, and Low Energy Jeb, and on and on and on. He rewrote the book on how to run for president because free media became the cornerstone of his campaign. He raised very little money, did not create a national organization. Even today, there are only like 5 or 10 staffers for the Trump campaign in key states like Arizona. It's amazing. And he did it all on free media, which the business is going to have to think long and hard about after the election is over.
Yeah, so, and as is my habit, I'm going to answer this question by telling a very quick story. So in 1960, a guy named Richard Nixon ran against John F. Kennedy, another World War II generation politicians. Kennedy from Massachusetts, Nixon had been governor of California, and they had a debate. And it was the first time that television really mattered in politics. So Kennedy comes out, he's young, nice looking, he's got a young sort of youthful look to him, he's glib, he's funny, and he allows Max Factor, I believe at the time, to put makeup on him, right? So he's matte, his skin looks good, he's looking good. Richard Nixon decides, real men don't wear makeup, I'm not putting that on, and he declines to be made up. He was actually not feeling well, he's sweating. And so when that black and white TV image comes over the screen, the television screens of the American audience who are all sitting watching the debate, Richard Nixon looks terrible, right? He looks ill, he's sweaty, he looks grumpy, he's got a mad face. Kennedy looks great. Skin looks good, hair looks good, right? Kennedy is declared hands down the winner of the debate. Ever since then, media has had an incredible influence over who becomes the president of the United States. It's very difficult for a George Herbert Walker Bush or a Bob Dole to beat a Bill Clinton because Bill Clinton will go on late night TV and play the saxophone in sunglasses. He's cooler, he's younger, he's more interesting. Ronald Reagan can beat a Jimmy Carter because Reagan is smooth, he's an actor, he knows how to talk and communicate, looks great on TV. The idea that being television ready, being camera ready, does not influence politics is just not true anymore. You have to be media friendly. And Donald Trump was the most media friendly candidate we've probably ever had because he works for us. Donald Trump and I worked for the same organization for years. He worked for NBC Universal at The Apprentice. Now, The Apprentice was scripted, right? So he's reading scripts, but he knows how to be on camera. He also knows how to entertain. And because typically the media is one step behind, right? We're not really leading, we're kind of one step behind. Donald Trump also understood social media, something you guys understood. He understood reality TV. He understood ratchet culture, which a lot of people in media didn't. And he knew that he could win without spending money or having a campaign because he could just dominate media. So we had a huge influence on Donald Trump, but he also influenced us. the media sort of became addicted to the entertainment value of Donald Trump. He got about $2 billion with a B dollars worth of free advertising from us. $2 billion. He got more coverage than any other candidate. Why? Jeb Bush, boring. Right? John Kasich, boring. These guys were not TV ready and they weren't TV friendly. And the only one that the media did kind of think was TV ready, Marco Rubio, he didn't have the gift of gab. He didn't know how to entertain us. And so unfortunately, going forward in the future, anybody who wants to be president of the United States has got to master media, has got to master social media, has to learn to entertain you guys. Because if we don't feel that the audience, particularly our core audience, which is people aged 25 to 54, are not entertained, the media won't pay attention. So yeah, the media had a huge, huge role, but it was also because the public now has much higher expectations for how media savvy our candidates are going to be.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Aram, and with the majority of everyday Americans getting their information about elections, about politics from the media, do you think that large media corporations like NBC, CNN should refrain from endorsing candidates?
I don't think they do. Broadcasters do. Newspapers do. But broadcasters.
No, yeah, television doesn't. Newspapers do. It's an interesting question because newspapers have this wall of separation between the editorial page, the op-ed page, and the paper, but no one really even believes that that's real, right? People think the Wall Street Journal is a conservative paper, the New York Times is perceived as a liberal paper. So those endorsements, they don't carry as much weight, I think, as they used to, but it's still sort of a stamp of approval that candidates want. I think in a way, TV does endorse just in the way that they cover. And so, but it changes, right? I think you could say that at least cable media endorsed Donald Trump for a year and then turned on him when it looked like he actually could be president, right? So I think that we endorse without endorsing. But as far as newspapers are concerned, the reality is newspapers still have an influence in one specific way. Because when you're tweeting out information or putting information on your Facebook page, you're still mostly tweeting out mainstream media. Most of what you're putting out there, the content still comes from the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, so they're still really influential.
No question. And just to newspaper endorsements, I guess everybody's noticed that most of them, maybe almost all of them,
all but three,
to Hillary Clinton, even from newspapers that have never before endorsed a Democratic candidate for president. So this is a change election in so many ways.
But I doubt convinced partisans of one campaign or another have ever changed their vote because their hometown newspaper has given their endorsement elsewhere. Conservatives have been in charge of politics in Arizona for a century, since Arizona became a state. And the Arizona Republic endorsed a Democratic candidate for the first time this time. I don't think any Donald Trump voters in Arizona are going to say, oh my God, the Republic endorsed Hillary Clinton, I have to vote for Hillary Clinton. Newspaper endorsements are informative, but they aren't definitive. And having said that, Donald Trump is convinced the entire media is against him and has endorsed his opponent anyway. Because if they cover what he actually says, he gets mad.
Hello, I'm Jada, and I'm in 9th grade. I would like to ask, how do you decide between broadcasting a story on recent events or covering more investigative journalistic ones?
That's a very good question, and we're glad to hear from the 9th graders. And more of you want to ask questions, you're welcome to. It depends on a couple things. I mean, it depends on the news organization, the program. The NewsHour, for example, we try to do a mix of covering today's news, what's happening right now. For example, yesterday, we spent a fair amount of time on the presidential campaign and on events overseas, like in Iraq, the battle to retake the city of Mosul, where ISIS took over a couple of years ago. They're trying to win that back. These are what we call current, today stories. But we will also take a longer look at, anything like we'll take, for example, we've done pieces in the last few days on healthcare, on education. These are stories that are always important. And it's just a matter of when did we have the time to send a reporter and a camera crew, producer, somebody to do the research, to gather that together and work on it. And so we try to make those stories come on air at a time when people are thinking about it, but they don't have to be tied to something that's happening right now. And I do want to hear what Ray and Joy have to say about this. In my view, there isn't enough investigative reporting going on today. I don't know how much you all talk about this in your classes, but journalism has taken a hit in the last 10 or 15 years in this country. The ownership of newspapers and, to a lesser extent, television, electronic media, and online has done a flip-flop. There are many new people involved in running news media organizations. Many news reporters have lost their jobs. The people whose job was to go out and spend all day long reporting and come back and put a story in a newspaper or on television. And so we don't have as many people doing that as we used to. And so I worry about where journalism is headed. Whenever I have a chance to talk to young people like you, I encourage you to go into journalism. We need a lot of good reporters. We need people who care about covering anything from politics to foreign policy to the law, education, medicine, science, and so on, the arts. We need all of that. Business, so I encourage you to go into it. But it is because we just aren't, news organizations aren't making money the same way they used to, and they don't have the money anymore to do as much investigative reporting. And it's something that I think our country is poorer off for not having.
Well, go on, you first.
Investigative reporting is very expensive and requires organizations making a long-term commitment to a story and putting often a team of people on a story. And as Judy mentioned, with head counts and budgets cut to the bone, if you tell your bosses, I'm not going to be on the air for 3 weeks, they're just not going to green light that story. They're going to say, we just can't do that because we need you on tomorrow and the next day and the next day, because we just don't have enough people to fill the hole if we take you out of circulation for the next coming weeks. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Spotlight, but that investigation on the part of the Boston Globe to root out sexual abuse among the clergy in the Boston Archdiocese took a long time. It took multiple people and took the encouragement and backing of management to get into the paper. It is much harder to do that kind of work now. If you enter a project with the understanding that you're going to be out of circulation, not getting in the paper, not getting on the radio, not having your face on TV, it is much less likely to be encouraged by the bosses because they need to fill time every day. Tomorrow's paper can't come out with a blank page where your story would have been if you weren't doing the investigative piece. So it's a very tough time for that part of the business.
Yeah, I think it's even worse for cable because we're 24 hours. And so when I was doing more of the national correspondent side of my job, the most frustrating thing is we would, for instance, get down to South Carolina for the Confederate flag story. And I wanted to be driving around and talking to people and doing some investigation, but the network wanted me to be there for a live shot every hour. So you're sort of stuck at a live shot and you can't do the thing you really want to do. It's become really hard. I think cable is probably in the worst position. There's still a lot of really great investigative newspaper stories, and there are divisions of our company, like 48 Hours and others, that still do it. But it's hard because it's expensive, and there's just constant need to feed the beast on the air. I will say that one of the things that is changing investigative reporting is crowdsourcing. The Black Lives Matter story, for instance, a lot of that content is actually coming from citizens. It's not coming from journalists. It's coming from citizens who are posting information, not even sending it to us anymore, but it's going on their own social media feeds. So we find that we're spending a lot of times following regular folks on Twitter and getting more information sometimes from you guys than we're able to gather ourselves. So it's become this real sort of crowdsourced team approach. It's interesting.
Yeah, I want to second what Joy just said, because today, what's changed so much about news coverage today is that we do invite and we want more public participation. Sometimes it's more than we can handle.
Yeah.
There'll be so much response when we put out requests for comment or information. There'll be so much coming in. We just don't have the ability to deal with all of it. But I think it's a healthy thing. You know, some people in our business lament the idea that the public is, in some regards, taken over some news coverage on the internet and social media without any editing or anybody to what we call curate the news to determine, okay, what's the most important, what's been confirmed and checked out and verified and what hasn't. But I think on balance, the democratization of news, the fact that more people are involved, is a good thing. And that's what your generation, you're going to see much, much more of that as you grow up and you participate in reading and watching and swimming in the news, as I know you will.
Before we throw dirt on the grave of investigative journalism, I do want to remind you that some of the really key stories from this election season have come from that long-term work, from freeing reporters to sit and sift through thousands of documents, looking at Donald Trump's charitable foundation, the real estate records, and the bankruptcy court records regarding his bankruptcies, his unwillingness to pay people that he has hired to do work for him. This is not something that comes to you and you just put it in the paper. This is something that requires going to municipal offices, making document requests, standing around all day while they Xerox thousands of pages, and then figuring out what you've got once you've got a pile of pages this high. David Fahrenthold, among many other reporters, done great work this cycle, giving us the background of someone who has an interesting background.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tyndall, and I'm a junior. So this was touched on a little bit in your opening remarks, but considering that this election is quite different from any presidential election this country has had, do you think that this election has initiated something and will change the way future elections happen?
Yeah, I think it has. I think the election has caused, I think, a lot of media to kind of take a step back and really think deeply about our role. I think a lot of people are having some sense of recrimination about the way that this election was covered. But I think that Donald Trump has proven that some of the conventional rules of reporting of running elections don't apply. That there are ways that you can become the nominee that are not the traditional route. So I think that you're going to see more unconventional candidates try to run and run, whether it's for president or for other offices, the way he did it. They won't be able to necessarily replicate it because they won't have his particular skill sets and background. But I think you're going to see a lot more of that. But look, he's not the first one. To run for office who was a celebrity. That's happened before, but the way that he did it without building a campaign infrastructure, I think shocked, as Ray said, a lot of the established media. So yeah, I think this election has established a brand new benchmark. And look, again, I'll sort of repeat what I said in the beginning. If a woman becomes president of the United States, that in and of itself changes everything. It's a completely different paradigm for American politics.
The other thing that I think that has changed the way we think about elections are the WikiLeaks, how do we describe it, flood of emails that have been released, which the U.S. intelligence community says is due to Russian hacking of the Democratic National Committee, of the private emails of a man named John Podesta, who was his campaign chairman. These emails, if you all are paying even a little bit of attention, you probably heard they're coming out on a regular basis. And the question is, what do we make of the fact that another country, Russia, is interfering in our election? It's believed they did the hacking, they stole the emails, they somehow provided them to WikiLeaks. That's not proven, but it appears to be the case. And what does that mean? I mean, in going forward, there's so much concern today about cyber hacking and stealing other people's emails, documents, and the rest of it. How is that going to affect future elections? This is the first time we've had to deal with this on a major scale, the way we are with WikiLeaks this time. It will continue to be in the news, I think, right up until Election Day. At least that's what they've said. So I think it's something that we all will be wrestling with for a long time to come.
It's pushed news organizations into places where they are not comfortable, because it's understood, as Judy mentioned from the beginning, that these communications are stolen. A crime was committed in order to possess them in the first place. So if someone hands you something that's stolen out on the street, you're legally liable. You're considered to be somebody who's in the chain of possession of stolen goods. If somebody gave you a bicycle when you left school today, you'd be in trouble too. But if you're a reporter and somebody hands you stolen communications, you've got a scoop. And that's an uncomfortable place to be. And it's something that's causing some real soul searching inside newsrooms. Also, this election has pushed news organizations into very uncomfortable places, because one of the most radioactive words in the English language, if you work in the news business, is the L word, lie. We never say that somebody lied, or we use all kinds of crazy euphemisms to avoid saying they misspoke, they misremembered, they miss all kinds of other things, but no one says they just lied. They knew X was the case and they said Y, so they are a liar. During this campaign, you can actually see it happening. News organizations were starting to pivot and use the word lie, which they're not comfortable doing, believe me. How hard it is to get the word lie into print or spoken on the air. And yet now, because we're in this really weird season, we've become more comfortable using that word, and it'll be interesting again to see if this was a one-off, or whether something has definitely changed about the business, so that in the future, because of the effect of these two candidates, we are now going to be more comfortable deciding that somebody lied.
Hi, my name is Karis and I'm a senior, and a lot of sources have said that the way that Donald Trump has acted and the harmful things that he has said has hurt the image of the Republican Party, and I want to know, do you guys agree with that? And if you agree with it, do you think that the Republican Party will be able to recover from the image that he has put out?
So I would just give you a sort of interesting statistic. You guys have heard of the gender gap? Maybe the 7th graders might not have, but maybe the older students have. The gender gap is this idea that Democrats do better with women. The gender gap is actually not quite true. The gender gap is really a racial gap. If you take Black and Latina and Asian American women out of the equation and only leave white American women, Republicans actually benefit from the gender gap. Mitt Romney got 14% more votes from white women than Barack Obama did. John McCain got 7% more. George W. Bush got 11% more. This gender gap has now shifted among that group of voters, meaning that white women voters are shifting toward the Democratic Party, even white women voters who work in an hourly job, right? Blue collar white women are tied. This is shocking and revolutionary for the Republican Party. It's been probably a good 50 years since Democrats were even able to win a majority of white voters, period. Barack Obama didn't do too badly. I think he got about 46% the second time. He only got 39% of the white vote overall. And particularly, it's pronounced among younger people, because studies have shown that the way you vote when you're between 18 and 30 tends to stay with you. People get a little more conservative as they get older, but your perceptions of the parties and who they are formed pretty early. And your generation, or the generation just a little older than you guys, my kids, who are between, my youngest is 16, my oldest one is 21, their perception of the Republican Party is incredibly negative. And there was just a poll that was out this morning that showed over 50%, something like 52, 53% of people believe that Donald Trump is more representative of the Republican Party than House Speaker Paul Ryan is. Partly because fewer people know who House Speaker Paul Ryan is. So because Donald Trump is the most recognizable Republican, he's forming people's opinion of what a Republican is. And that is very problematic. Going back again to my favorite era, the 1960s, a guy named Barry Goldwater ran for president as a Republican, and as a result of him running and opposing the Civil Rights Act to make it so that black and white people could eat at the same lunch counters and things like that, that formed the perception that African Americans still have of the Republican Party. To this day, African Americans are very opposed and very negative about the Republican Party. That ingrained perception stayed with them. And now you're seeing that really starting with Mitt Romney in 2012, Latinos have developed this pretty negative view of the Republican Party, whereas it used to be about 2/3 of Latinos were Democrats and about 1/3 were Republican. That number, that 35% is shrinking. In the latest poll we did, Donald Trump only has 17% of Latino voters supporting him. This is actually not a good thing for the Republican Party because it's now spilling over into Asian Americans who are starting to vote just like African Americans and just like Latinos. So where I'm going with this is that the Republican Party is becoming essentially a white political party. And because our demographics in this country are changing, look at this lovely group of you guys, right, as diverse as you are, that's what America looks like. Your generation is the most diverse generation ever in American history. And by 2020, more than 30% of voters are going to be non-white. And if you're the Republican Party, that means you've got to get almost 70% of the white vote in order to win. And nobody has gotten that. Ronald Reagan got 66. That's the highest percent of the white vote that anybody's ever gotten. So since the 60s and the 50s. So the problem for the Republican Party is that yes, the perception among people of color is very, very, very negative, and it's tied to Donald Trump. We'll see if they can turn it around.
After the numbers were in from the 2012 election, showing that lopsided majorities of various constituency groups voted against the Republican Party, they had a party conference and they responded to a report that played out today's demographics and looked down the road to when your kids are voting and said, we can't remain a national party if we keep putting up numbers like this. A Latino turns 18 every 30 seconds. It must be tiring for that kid, wherever he is, but no, it's actually different people who are turning 30, but turning 18. And this is something I can speak neutrally about because I'm not a woman. Joy's right that there is a racial dimension to the gender gap, and that it doesn't exist in its most blunt 30,000 feet cruising altitude way, but there are other ways of slicing it, generationally, and also married and unmarried. Republicans get a very sizable majority of married women, and Democrats do really, really well among unmarried women. That was not a problem for the Republican Party when a greater percentage of American women between 18 and 65 were married. But now that the country is changing in a way that more adult women are unmarried for more of their lives, it's a huge problem for them. And also it has a racial dimension because one of the reasons why the unmarried vote is so large is because there's a very large young generation of non-white women in the country who are marrying later. And they're going to vote in 2 or 3 or 4 cycles before they get married. It's an enormous problem for the Republican Party. They had this conference, they had this report, they had this soul searching, and then they went ahead and did the same thing that they did in earlier elections. They didn't act like a party that really thought they had this problem that they reported to themselves about. So whether they think they can squeeze out enough white votes in the coming cycles to stay plausible as a national party is a really big question that they are going to have to ask themselves some really tough questions about. And Democrats would be fools if they would assume that they can just dine richly on this demographic gift and not deliver in policy terms to keep those voters in their corral. The idea that we just get these people because they don't like Republicans, that would be a lazy response and they would deserve to lose.
And I just have a quick postscript, and that is if the Republicans this year had somehow, if Republicans who went to the polls during the primaries had been a group of people who, say, chose Marco Rubio, who's a Cuban American, or even Jeb Bush, who happens to be married to a Latina. And if just to pick two, and they had particularly pursued the Hispanic vote in this country, had pursued the African American vote in this country, you could have a very different scenario today. You could have had potentially a much closer election than what we're watching with Donald Trump. So much depends on who goes out and votes in those primaries, who makes up the party in those primaries, who votes, and then who do they choose and what kind of campaign do they run.
And if I could just add one more note. So people laugh when folks talk about Kanye West 2020, right? Kanye. See, even you guys are laughing at Kanye 2020. Kanye 2020 is not crazy. It's not a crazy idea because it is a crazy idea. But it's not crazy in the sense that unconventional candidates can do really better than we thought. People with high name recognition who understand media and social media. So you just never know who could run. But in 2020, a magical and terrifying thing is going to happen that every Republican strategist who I know is thinking about right now, and it's called the United States Census. You guys know about the census, right? Once every 10 years, we count up how many of us there are. We count up how many men, how many women, how many black, how many white, how many Latino, how many Asian. We count it all up, and then we decide how many representatives each state gets, how many electoral votes everybody gets, and we decide lots and lots of things that lock each of these parties into their positions for 10 years. In 2020, you can have a presidential election and a census in the same year. This is what's called the Armageddon election for the Republican Party. And it is that because if Hillary Clinton wins in 2020, the Democrats will have the incumbency of the White House, and it's harder to defeat an incumbent president than you think. It seems like it is not that hard, but it's actually not that easy to do. And the census will be on the line. And in presidential years, non-white voters and younger voters come out in much higher numbers, something like 60% turnout, whereas in those midterm elections, the off-year elections, it drops into the 40s, which Republicans do much better. And the census in the last couple censuses have been in these off years, so the Republicans have done really well. They've got lots of wins in Congress and in the states. Well, this time, they've got to fight that census election with a presidential election on top of it. Republicans are very concerned about this. They have to fix their demographic problem now, and they have to fix their woman problem now. The last news cycle, which was the thing that terrified us the most about coming and talking to kids today, because it's been really gross, right? The news cycle recently. It's hard for me to talk to my kids about it. They're older. This is setting the Republican Party back with women in a really, really fundamental way, and they're nervous about it.
Unfortunately, I'm so sorry. I'm really, 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 really sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about Kim Kardashian being first lady.
These kids have to get back to class, and I thank each of you so much for your time.